Hello, friends, and welcome to the January 20th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with the Texas legislature. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and this week we're coming to you from Houston, featuring a conversation with Juan Cardoza-Oquendo, Director of Policy and Elections with Houston in Action, an organization that convenes member organizations interested in impacting systemic change rooted in racial justice and equity for historically excluded groups. It is an important reminder for those of us in the faith community to always be looking to expand our networks, both in our local communities and at the state level, and always working to ensure that all voices are represented. It's also a reminder that Texas Impact has tools for you to connect with others in your communities or around issues that you care about. Go to texasimpact.org and click Join a Team to find out how you can connect. And while you're there, check the events calendar to see how you can join the fun in Austin. Last week, we highlighted the Interfaith Service of Public Witness. January 29th through 31st, the United Women in Faith come to Austin, and everyone is welcome to join us for the Interfaith Advocacy Days, February 19th through 21st. Make sure that you're signed up to stay in the loop with everything that's going on. And with that, enough announcements for today. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Juan Cardoza-Oquendo. Joining us for today's conversation is Juan Cardoza-Oquendo, Director of Policy and Elections with Houston in Action. Juan, so good to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
It's been great connecting with you. I know we have a mutual friend, former LBJ school alums, all of us, Katie Floyd Wang, and so I was glad that she was able to make this connection today. Juan, why don't you start out by talking first, what is Houston in Action and why have you chosen to be involved in this work?
Yes, so Houston in Action is a network of organizations working to remove barriers to civic engagement for historically marginalized communities. Historically marginalized communities for us are communities of color, low-income communities, LGBTQ plus communities, young people, and women, right? Those are all communities and populations that are part of those broader historically marginalized communities. And we bring organizations together to build people's power, to build people's ability to influence the decisions that impact their lives. So what that looks like is a lot of coordination, a lot of facilitation, a lot of working with organizations to create a collective vision for what Greater Houston should look like in terms of civic engagement, in terms of policy. It looks like coordinating voter engagement, increasing voter turnout, educating voters on the issues, building organizations' capacity to organize, which is to build leaders in their communities and to hold elected officials accountable on the issues that impact communities.
And that's really important work, and certainly work that Texans of faith care about. One of the questions our listeners always like to hear from people that we talk to is why you've chosen to do this work. I wonder if you could share a little bit about your story.
Yeah. So my dad was a pastor in Puerto Rico, in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Puerto Rico. My mom was a very proud pastor's wife. She loved that role in Puerto Rico and then in New York. I grew up always having to go to church. It was never an option not to go to church. I grew up in Atlanta. Our church just happened to be a church where most people, especially in the late 90s, 2000s, most of our brothers and sisters in the church were undocumented from Mexico and Central America.
Right.
And that practice of going to church every Sunday and being in community with that particular community, which faces a lot of oppression, a lot of xenophobia, right, racism. It was later in life that I realized, oh, wait a minute, my commitment, my interest in social justice and organizing, I can't separate that from the fact that I worship God with the immigrant community. And every Sunday I had to think and reflect on the presence of God in immigrant communities. And Jesus' teachings and the fact that God gave his son to the world, for me, I see salvation. There's an individual relationship that we have with God and with Jesus as Christians, speaking from my tradition, but there's also a collective aspect to salvation. And Jesus came down to earth, and God sent his son to redeem the world. And we, as Christians, we're a part of that work of redemption. And for me, that's organizing and making sure that our systems and our policies lift up people, no matter their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, their income, where they come from, etc.
Yeah, I love that idea that you've used a couple of times of the diversity of creation and all of the different groups that need to be at the table. Why don't you talk some about why it's important that we have coalitions that are diverse, that bring together all of the different aspects of our community, especially those who have been underrepresented, especially in a city like Houston, right?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of forces that keep communities separate. And if we bring communities of color together, we're stronger together. A lot of communities, Black, Latino, API, other communities as well, face a lot of the same issues and challenges, have a lot of the same needs and concerns for their families and for their children. By bringing communities together, we're able to have a bigger impact. We're able to fight the systems that keep people poor, that keep people oppressed. That's why it's so important to work across racial lines, to work across other lines of identity, because we actually share a lot more than we think, than what society has us think, than what the media makes us think. Greater Houston is majority people of color. Our Latino community is about 42% of our region. Black is about in the 20-something percent. API around 8%. Communities of color are the majority here. We need systems that lift up communities of color, help people be able to make a living for themselves and for their families, be able to have free access to the ballot box to vote. That's why it's so important to work across these lines of identity.
Yeah, I think it's been great watching Houston in action grow over the course of the last few years and bring these coalitions together. There are certainly real opportunities here in Houston to be able to coalition build, but also some real challenges, right? Like that's sometimes hard work and geography here in Houston. It's a giant place. Talk to us some about some things statewide we could learn from how you've been able to do it successfully here in Houston.
Yeah, so one concept that we talk about in the Houston in Action team is moving at the speed of trust. So it's really important to build trust. The nonprofit industrial complex means that a lot of times nonprofits are competing for money. There is a mindset that there isn't enough money for us to do our work, and organizations start competing with each other. Right. Add to that all the racial differences and other identity differences, getting in the way. So that's one. Building trust is really important. We also have working principles and community agreements that we begin every meeting with. And these working principles help ground ourselves in the long-term mission of Houston in Action, which is to build power in historically marginalized communities. Our community agreements as well, that's how folks should behave, right? It's crazy to think about having to remind adults how to behave, but it's Same as, when you were in grade school and had classroom rules, we have community agreements of how we're supposed to work. Those have also been really helpful. Also, I'm proud to say that we're a flexible organization. Okay. Our executive director is always encouraging us to think expansively, to not be strict or nitpicky with what a particular organization does or what they say and do, but to really keep a long-term focus. That's actually one of our community agreements. So being flexible and working with everybody and anybody who wants to build power in our communities of focus will work with you. So those are some of the concepts of practices that have helped us. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. Yeah, right. A lot of what we do is building trust, getting people on board to a collective plan. That takes time. It takes a lot of conversations, a lot of trust building, and trust building takes time.
Yeah, trust building does take time. Also, like that you talked about the long-term nature of the work. As we're here in the legislative session, I'll be reminded often that the long-term view is what we need to take. But speaking of power, one of the things we wanted to talk with you about is elections. And Houston in Action is focused a lot on increasing voter turnout in the greater Houston area. So why is that one of the areas of focus for the organization? I mean, I guess the answer is obvious, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. So by increasing voter turnout, we're going to see that our communities of focus, communities that historically haven't had a say in who gets elected and the kinds of laws and policies that elected officials pass, those communities will have a greater say in the policies and systems that shape their lives. So increasing voter turnout, why is it so important? It's elected officials are making decisions day in and day out on issues that affect our quality of life, our education, the criminal justice system, immigration, the environment, environmental justice, climate change, all of these decisions that directly affect our lives. We need historically marginalized communities to be fully participating in the decisions that affect their lives in policy making. If you vote, elections have the classic saying, elections have consequences. Turning out to vote actually decides who's your governor, who's your state senator, who's your state rep, who's your city council person, who's your judge. There's a direct link with who's making the decisions. Secondly, if your community is voting at a higher rate, elected officials and the people making decisions on policy pay attention to you. So it's important to super long term, we have a long way to go of increasing voter turnout in communities of color and other marginalized communities. But over the long term, if communities vote at a higher rate, we're going to see that who gets elected, that whole landscape is going to change. We're going to see that the issues, what's on the policy agenda at the state legislature, on commissioner's court, on city council, we're going to see that policy agenda is going to change as well. It's hard. People are discouraged, right? If talking about Black, Latino, API communities, poor communities, what's in it for them, right? We, year in and year out, we as community organizations tell them, go out and vote, but nothing seems to change, right? So it's super uphill, but it doesn't decrease the urgency of that voter engagement work. It just means we have to be creative, we have to be persistent, we have to keep a long-term focus.
So it is important to remember the long-term view of things, but we did just come out of an election cycle, and I wonder if you can share any thoughts about like what went well here in Houston and where can we still continue to do work?
So we had over 50 organizations educate voters and turn them out to vote in this past election. It was the second highest turnout in a midterm in the last 30 years or so. We saw community organizations that had never done voter engagement work before do it. Connect voter engagement with the issues that they organize around. So that went really well. We're seeing an elections administrator who is, we saw a lot of problems on election day here in Harris County, but we do have an elections administrator who is committed to fixing those problems. And there's room there to build, to continue building a positive relationship with the elections administrator's office and continue and bolster community engagement in historically marginalized communities. Yeah. On election day itself, we had dozens of coordinators all at polling sites, directing people to polling locations that didn't have issues so they can go ahead and cast their ballot, talking to our election protection partners about issues that they were seeing at the polls, working directly with voters to aid them in the process and make the process as comfortable as possible. And we were all across Harris County, and we're really proud of that.
So you talked about your faith at the beginning, and our audience is Texans of faith. And I wonder if you see a particular role for the faith community in increasing voter participation and what that role might be.
Yes. So we have a lot of harmful narratives going around, especially after Trump was president and the rise of the Stop the Steal groups, the Stop the Steal narrative, white supremacist narratives that emphasize scarcity, that emphasize fear of the other, that emphasize distrust in democracy, which is messy by definition, which is hard by definition. Our faiths provide much stronger, much richer narratives than those that your traditional political parties can offer, or that, much less any of these extremist narratives that we see popping up from the right, from the extreme right. People of faith, we have the ability to think long term, because our faiths, that's faith itself. Faith is a whole nother way of thinking about things. I'm a Christian, I believe in God. God is the Alpha and the Omega. God, there's no beginning, no middle, no end to God. God's love persists forever, right? There's a lot of places in the Bible that say that. If we have this framework of mind, people of faith can go in and not be burnt out by this work of justice and this work of policy advocacy and organizing. And people of faith can offer that to people of no faith, and in secular spaces as well. That's something, the practices of prayer and reflection, spiritual reflection, those are all things that people of faith can offer to the broader movement for justice. I think also promoting narratives around love, around community, that as well. Our faith traditions are full of those stories in our holy texts. So the people of faith have that role too, to offer these larger narratives that bring people together, that encourage people to see their destinies as connected to each other.
Well, we are in the midst of legislative session, and so post-session, I'm sure we'll spend a lot of time talking about election 2024, both the primaries and the general election, and the ways that communities of faith can get involved. But we are in legislative session, right? So here in Texas, we get to do this every other year for 140 days. I wonder if Houston in Action will be watching the Texas legislature and how you plan on interacting with folks in the Capitol.
Absolutely. I just was on a call with the Texas Election Reform Coalition. So we're monitoring legislation and actions that happen at the Capitol, especially around voting rights. That's very central to our mission as Houston in Action of increasing people's ability to have a say in civic life. So we'll be monitoring voting rights. We'll be working with our partners in Austin. If there's action that we need to take here in Greater Houston, at district meetings, at in-district meetings, the Greater Houston delegation, Greater Houston's about 20% of the state. Sorry, I had to represent Houston.
Hey, I grew up near here. I'm all right with it.
So, to talk to the Houston delegation, meetings here that need to happen in district, we're ready to support. So mostly monitoring and then connecting where we need to mobilize folks in Greater Houston to come out to Austin or mobilize here in Greater Houston. We'll do that.
We'll definitely look forward to seeing you in Austin if you ever come over. I do wonder, before we close out, is voting rights the primary issue you're watching? I assume your coalition is kind of all geared up to work on that. Anything else y'all are keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so, we, as Houston in Action, as a network and a hub, we're all about what our members' policy priorities are. So we have a lot of members who work on criminal justice. So we'll be supporting them on criminal justice legislation that'll move in Austin. We have a lot of members. We have some members who work with the LGBTQ plus communities. So we'll also be, fighting back any anti-LGBTQ plus bills, supporting our members in doing that. We also support members in around climate justice and environmental justice. So we'll also be monitoring legislation in those areas. Really, where our members, what they want to focus on, we'll be there to support them, and we'll also be there to connect them. There's lobbying outfits in Austin, organizations who are there, probably like Texas Impact itself.
I've heard rumors of some of them, but yeah.
Yeah. So we're there to also connect. Make sure that we're connecting organizations that have a more grassroots focus with those who have a more legislative focus.
Yeah. All right, Juan, I really appreciate the conversation today. I do want to give you a chance before we close out to leave us with any shameless plugs you might have.
Yeah, so at Houston in Action, we're ready to work with Texas Impact, with members of Texas Impact, people of faith here in Greater Houston. There is a place for you. There's a place for all of us in this movement for justice. So we're just so excited to work with Texas Impact, with the Texas Impact Network here in Greater Houston. We are going to be forming a racial justice policy agenda that is going to center our work in 2023. We want to push for bold policies from our Commissioner's Court, from City Council, from our state legislature. So lots of exciting opportunities to build relationships across lines of race, class, sexual orientation, other lines of identity. Come on down.
All right. Well, again, really appreciate the conversation today. It's been great hearing about Houston in Action and hanging out with you for a few today. So thanks again.
Thank you, Scott.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and I hope we all use it as motivation to expand our networks and find ways to work in coalition with other groups who share our values. Being in community with others who care for justice and equality helps, both in terms of building influence, but also to make the journey more bearable. The 140 days of legislative session can feel like a slog, but we need to remember that we always have to be taking the long view, and that's easier if we have partners in the journey. As we wrap up, make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast and sharing it with your friends and congregations, and go to texasimpact.org for other ways you can get involved during the legislative session. While you're there, make sure that you and your congregation sign up to be members of Texas Impact and support this podcast and the work of Texas Impact year-round. And with that, I think it's time to close out this episode, so remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnett, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.